This lecture is on motivation and emotion. This lecture is first given to AP Psychology on Friday, January 2nd, 22nd. And here we go. We're going to start with motivation. Take a look at the following images. If the following images motivated you to eat, if you feel hungry about it, then that means that you are psychologically motivated to eat. We are both psychologically and physiologically motivated to eat. Obviously, we need food to maintain our sense of health and our ability to stay alive. But psychologically, we can also be inspired and motivated to eat. Motivation is an internal state. It's a state of being. Something that we feel that activates behavior and it directs it towards a goal. So it activates some sort of behavior and directs it towards what we want, what is motivating us. The things that do motivate us are motives. These are the needs, the wants, the interests, and the desires that propel and drive people in certain directions. At our most basic level, we have the instinct theory of motivation. Although humans don't really have a whole lot of just instinctual behaviors, the instinct theory is basically more centered around animals and how they have certain behaviors that are programmed into their DNA. Like, for example, whales or birds that migrate during different seasons. They don't know why they do it, they just do it. And it's that instinct that's built in, and that's what motivates them to really kind of go forward. Humans, on the other hand, don't really have a whole lot of instinct theories. Maybe looking for the mother to drink breast milk when we're an infant might be an instinct, but even that still has to be somewhat taught. But ultimately, most of our motives and our motivations come from different methods. At our most basic level, we have the drive reduction theory. The drive reduction theory says that we are motivated by certain drives, and those drives are created by needs. These needs are basic and they're built into us, like, for example, the need for food, water, sleep. These needs in turn create drives. Uh, the need for food would create the drive of hunger. The need for water would create the drive of thirst. The need for sleep would create the drive of exhaustion. That motivates us then to do drive reducing behaviors, such as eating, drinking, or sleeping. Ultimately, the reason why we do this is because we need to have our body be maintained in homeostasis. This is a state of internal balance where our body just needs us to be in a certain state where we need a certain amount of sleep, a certain amount of food, a certain amount of water, and etc. But those aren't the only things that motivate us. Sometimes we're motivated by our own interests. We're motivated by our own curiosity. The optimal arousal theory says that we are also motivated to seek out things that interest us, seek out things that are interesting to us, that we want to discover and we want to have and know more. So, for example, if you were stuck on a desert island and you had your basic needs met, you had a place to sleep, you had food, you had fresh water, you may not just sit on the desert or on the beach the whole time. Instead, you would search around the island to see what you have because you want to explore more. And that's that optimal arousal theory. But the optimal arousal theory is also centered around the Yerkes-Dodson law. And the Yerkes-Dodson law basically says that when we are seeking out those behaviors, our own level of exhaustion or our own level of arousal, meaning like how worked up we are, can affect how successful we're going to be at those different behaviors. So, for example, if you're playing basketball and you are really, really tired, so low arousal, then you're probably not going to do very well. But if you're super nervous because you're in front of a big crowd, then you're also probably not going to do well either. It's that optimal arousal, that middle ground, that Goldilocks zone that would make a difference. To put in a non-sports way, if you were taking a test and you were super tired, you probably wouldn't do so well. If you were taking a test and you were really, really nervous, that might affect, again, your overall success rate. But if you're in that middle where you're stimulated, but not overstimulated, then that's where you're going to hit that ultimate optimal arousal where you can be the most successful at discovering and accomplishing new things. But we're also motivated by rewards. These rewards can be internal or external. This is called the incentive theory. Internal rewards are called intrinsic motivation. These are the things that motivate us because we want to have that internal feeling of success, or because we want to maybe avoid that internal feeling of failure. But ultimately, it comes down to how we grow as an individual or how other things may hinder us as individuals. And that's the intrinsic motivation because it's built inside of us. But sometimes we're also looking for rewards. Sometimes we're also looking for things to make our life better, things that are outside of us. We would call that extrinsic motivation. And extrinsic motivation are rewards like money or praise or things like that. But again, both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation can be both positive and negative. Meaning, like with intrinsic motivation, we might be motivated to have a stronger feeling of success. For example, if we're motivated to do well in school, we might be motivated because we want that sense of accomplishment or sense of success, but we're also motivated by our fear of failure. With extrinsic motivation, we may be motivated to get some reward, but we also may be motivated to avoid a punishment. There are certain behaviors that are both biologically and socially motivated, meaning that our biological needs, our physiological needs motivate us, but also our social and psychological needs. One of these things is hunger. On the biological side, with hunger, it really comes down to what we call our set point. Our set point is basically our weight. If we're at a certain weight and we're really, really active, then our set point lowers and we eat to get back to that original set point. On the other hand, if we're at a certain set point of our weight and we may eat a lot, then we may be motivated to stop eating. So ultimately, that set point will go back to its original state. A lot of this is defined by the hormones, especially the hormones in both our pancreas and our stomach. In our pancreas, we have a hormone called insulin, and insulin regulates our blood sugar so that when we're really, really hungry, insulin will regulate the blood sugar and make us feel tired and irritable, ultimately motivating us to eat more. In the stomach, we have ghrelin and leptin. Ghrelin is the hormone that affects us when we feel hungry. And so when our stomach is full or when our stomach is empty, ghrelin is what motivates us to eat more. Leptin, on the other hand, is what motivates us to stop eating. When our stomach is full, our stomach produces that hormone, and we're motivated to stop eating so that we can get back to a certain set point. Ultimately, these hormones are regulated by two parts of the hypothalamus, because again, with hormones, we're talking about the endocrine system, and the hypothalamus regulates the endocrine system. The lateral hypothalamus is what is activated when we're very hungry. And the ventromedial hypothalamus is what is activated when we're kind of full. Now, we can abbreviate those and create a small little mnemonic for them. The lateral hypothalamus has the initials of LH, which you can reduce down to lots of hunger. And the ventromedial hypothalamus has the initials of VMH, which we can stand for very minute hunger, showing that with lots of hunger, we want to eat more, the lateral hypothalamus, and with very minute hunger, we want to stop eating or eat less, and that's the ventromedial hypothalamus. But your metabolism also plays a role in your set point as well. As you as your body breaks down food, it can break it down and cause and have your body basically burn the calories that we take in. That's what metabolism is. Some people's metabolism is faster than others. And certainly the metabolism is going to be influenced by our set point and also by the overall activity of our body. Those people who may have a lot of fat may have a slower metabolism because fat doesn't take a whole lot of calories to maintain. And yet, for those people who build muscle, their metabolism will speed up, causing them to reduce their set point even further because it takes more calories to maintain and regulate the muscles. So, if you're looking to lose weight, cardio is great because it reduces the fat. But truly, to really take the pounds off, if you build muscle, your basal metabolic rate will increase and it will take more calories to get there. And eventually, if you have more calories burned than what you're taking in, eventually your set point will gradually get lower and lower and lower as you lose more and more weight. However, sometimes we eat even when we're not hungry. These are the social and psychological motives of hunger. Sometimes we learn what we like, and that's often a cultural thing. In our country, we wouldn't like something like Vegemite. If you don't know what that is, look it up. It's really popular in Australia, and yet in Australia, they would never eat peanut butter. Why? Because these are cultural preferences that are built in. And if you can think about different cultures and some of the kind of weird and different foods that they might eat, it's because of those learned preferences. But it also becomes a form of classical conditioning. Because as we eat those foods that we have a preference for, our body feels good. And then when we see those foods or think about those foods later on, uh, we may be motivated to eat even when we're not hungry because we know how good it makes us feel. For example, I really like hamburger and french fries, and I would eat an In-N-Out Double Double even if I'm not hungry because I know how good it makes me feel because I like it so much. Additionally, stress can also affect our motivation of hunger. Stress produces a hormone that can cause us to have really, really negative feelings. This hormone is called cortisol. We'll talk about it later in the unit. And when cortisol is produced, we want to avoid those negative feelings. So we may eat more, which makes us feel good, produces dopamine, and reduces the effects of cortisol. But sometimes stress can also motivate people to not eat. Sometimes stress can cause a person to become in such a high state of agitation or arousal that it could also cause a person to say, I'm really not hungry at all. Another behavior that is both biologically and socially and psychologically motivated is sex. Now, sex is obviously really important because we have to have sex to survive as a species. If we don't, literally our species will go extinct. Biologically, though, we're not motivated to have sex until we've passed puberty. Once we pass puberty, then our body is in a natural state to produce children or to go through the motions to produce children. And these are highly influenced by our sex hormones, testosterone in men, estrogen in women. But actually, both genders have both hormones. There's just more testosterone in men and less estrogen, and the reverse for women, more estrogen in women and less testosterone. But we also may be socially and psychologically motivated to have sex. External stimuli causes us to think about sex. Like, for example, magazine covers, advertisements that you might see on the side of buses, TV shows, movies, and that might motivate a person to carry out sexual activity. Additionally, we don't even need to see that to be motivated to carry out sexual activity. We can just imagine and think about the different kind of sexual things, and that may cause us to be more motivated to carry out sexual behavior. But socially, we could also be motivated to have sex or not have sex. peer pressure can easily influence people, especially young people, to carry out sexual behavior because they feel like they have to or they want to. Like, for example, if you have a group of people and they're all talking about their different sexual activities that they've carried out, you may find that somebody who isn't that feels left out. And because they feel left out, they're more motivated to have sex to be part of the group. Um, or it could be a status thing. If you have, let's say, like in high school, you have a younger person dating an older person, they may be peer pressure to have sex because the older person is more biologically mature and more ready for sexual activity. Gender influence plays a role too. Certainly, when we talk about social norms of sexual activity, there's a lot of built-in social norms. For example, if a male has a good amount of sexual activity, he's often seen by his peers as somebody who's had a lot of conquests. And yet, if a female does that, she's often motivated to have less sexual behavior because she may be what we might call slut-shamed. But not all behavior has biological motivations. The need to belong, or our affiliation needs, is something that's really, really ingrained into us and built in, but is not biologically needed. Now, this ultimately goes back to evolution and in cave people, why we wanted to, be around other people. We have these needs for connections. Back when we were cave people, if you were alone, you probably died because you might have fallen off a cliff, maybe you got injured, maybe you starved, maybe you were hunted by a predator. By being connected with other people, it increased our chance of survival. And so that attribute has been passed on evolutionarily and built into our DNA. Additionally, if you look at it from the flip side, ostracism, fear of ostracism or fear of being kind of socially shut out, is also a really, really strong motivator for our affiliation needs. Again, we go back to cave people days. If we were part of a tribe and yet then shut out by that tribe, our chance of death was much higher. So we have this ingrained built-in fear of ostracism and fear of being kind of left out from being part of a group. Now, these days, social networking and social media plays a huge role in our affiliation needs. Some of them good and some of them not as good. Now, you could say that in one respect, social media has helped our affiliation needs because it allows us to build more connections with more people from other parts of the world that we may not see in person. And yet, if you think about it, social media has also created a sense of social isolation where all of a sudden, you may be so focused on being on your computer or being on your phone that you actually don't even have person-to-person interaction. Additionally, we also have the idea of narcissism. Narcissism is people who carry out behavior just for the basically attention seeking. And if you think about someone like Instagram influencers, many of these people have very high narcissistic tendencies. And they produce these photos or stories that get people to notice them because they need people to notice them. That is not necessarily really, really sound in terms of our own individual health because a person will constantly need that gratification of being, noticed again and again and again. And at the same time, when they're doing it, those people who may not be the influencer, who see those pictures or those stories and say, wow, your life is great and my life sucks, makes them feel less about themselves and it makes them feel worse about themselves. And so what we see with social media is that there's both good and bad things with social media. Though these days, I think a lot of the more negative aspects of social media have been really kind of brought to light as well. Finally, we'll talk about emotions. In our body, we have a lot of things that can cause emotional responses. When we do certain behaviors or feel certain things, certain neurotransmitters are passed, like endorphins, which may make us feel good, or serotonin, which may make us feel happy. But if we have a lack of serotonin or a lack of endorphins, we may feel depressed. Our autonomic nervous system is centered around the idea of fight or flight, which is centered around the emotion of fear. Our endocrine system produces hormones, and hormones, when we have these changes to our body chemistry, there's always a change of emotional response that goes along with it. Within our brain, the amygdala controls really, really strong negative emotions like fear and anxiety. Our frontal lobes control how we interpret those emotions, how we judge those emotions based on our past experiences. Finally, the right hemisphere handles all our positive emotions, and the left hemisphere handles the negative ones. So, what's an emotion? What is it? Well, ultimately, it comes down to four distinct things. Now, in what order is really the question. Ultimately, there's four things that have to happen. First is an interpretation of a stimulus. Something has to stimulate us. Something has to make us feel, but it is only our own interpretation of that stimulus that makes us feel a certain way. That then in turn, so for example, if someone hit you in the face, you may become angry. If you saw two people talking in a corner and looking at you, you might feel like they're talking at you, but they may not be. But you may interpret it, even if that stimulus is not real, you can still interpret it that it is. And so it can still create that overall subjective feeling where we decide how we feel about that stimulus based on our interpretation. Ultimately, it's almost always going to cause some sort of physiological response. Our heartbeat starts going faster. Our breath starts going faster. We may experience, especially in the emotions of something like disgust or fear, we may experience nausea within our stomach. And that ultimately leads to an observable behavior. 90% of his observable behaviors are nonverbal. So we're talking about facial expressions and we're talking about body language that really demonstrates how we feel about a certain stimulus. These are the four things, but the question is, in what order do these things experience? And in some cases, are all four present? There are many competing theories of how we experience emotions, and truly it comes down to the order in which we experience those emotions. The James Longa theory says that the emotional event happens first, and based on that event, our body just reacts. We interpret the reaction of our body, of that physiological response, and then ultimately that's where we carry out that emotional response or observable behavior. The Cannon-Bard theory says that there is no interpretation, though. It says that that stimulating event happens, and then at the same time, we feel and we respond together. The Schachter two-factor theory, or the Schachter-Singer theory, but literally so many people just call it the Schachter two-factor theory because it rhymes and it's easy to remember, says that there are two factors that play into our emotional response. First, the event happens, and then at the same time, we experience a physiological arousal, so something within our body to be worked up, and a cognitive appraisal, which is a form of an interpretation. These two things happen together. These are the two factors. And then ultimately, we have our emotional response that occurs together. The Lazarus theory is the one that basically says our interpretation comes first, though. The Lazarus theory says that the event happens, then we have our thought and interpretation, which leads to both our physiological arousal and our emotional response taking place together. There are some other emotional theories, however, things that don't necessarily relate to those four main aspects of emotions. The Zedonic-Ledoux theory says that we have an instant embodied response, and this often occurs with the emotion of fear. So, say, for example, you're watching a horror movie and someone jumps out around the corner and you jump and you're afraid instantly. You didn't have time to interpret it. You didn't have time to feel it. It just instantly occurred. And so in some cases, the Zedonic-Ledoux theory may be evident, especially in the cases of fear. And then finally, we have the opponent process theory, which says that our emotions work as pairs or opposites. And basically, we have, like, for example, happy and sad. So when someone is happy, they are not going to be sad. Or when someone is sad, they are not going to be happy. So as we experience one of these pairs, our brain essentially suppresses the other one so that we can't experience both at the same time. Now, what are some characteristics of emotions? Well, ultimately, all emotions, no matter what it is, based on your interpretation, can cause some sort of arousal or calming aspect in just instantly within your autonomic nervous system. For example, we may be really angry and we may get worked up and our heart might go crazy and our rate might go crazy. But you can also have those people who are really calm in cold anger, which is kind of scary. And at the same time, if you think about happiness, sometimes happiness makes us really, really excited, but sometimes it just makes us feel good and feel calm. All emotions have either a positive or negative quality to them. So certain emotions, even ones that are kind of more in the border, still we could consider something to be positive or negative. So like if, for example, the emotion of disgust might be a little bit more negative than positive, but it's also positive because it protects us from things that might be harmful. And then finally, we have the spillover effect. And the spillover effect says that when we are in a state of arousal due to one emotion, that state of arousal can cause a different emotion to be generated. So, for example, when you take a look at what happened on January 6th, you had a lot of people that were really excited to hear President Trump speak about the election and their interpretations of the election. And those people were excited, they were exuberant, their emotions were high, but then as they marched to the Capitol, that emotion changed from excitedness to anger and ultimately led to the storming of the Capitol, which we just witnessed just a few weeks ago. This is what we would call the spillover effect because that state of arousal that was created by one emotion spilled over and led to the creation of a separate emotion with an equal state of arousal. And that is where we stop.